Please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us out. And of course, if you have any questions, comment below and we will answer you as soon as we can. Welcome to another video in our series on IGCSE History. In today's lesson, we will be looking at the Cold War, between 1961 and 1972. If you haven't seen our previous videos, click on the card above.
In today's video, we'll be looking at the Cold War between 1961 and 1972. Just as the 1960s started, a new American president entered the White House. The Cold War was about to enter its most critical phase, when the world would be pushed to the brink of nuclear war. Firstly, let's start out by talking about the Berlin Wall. John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, bringing with him an uncompromising attitude towards the Soviet Union and international communism. At the Yalta Conference of 1945, Germany and its capital city Berlin were both divided into 4 zones of occupation. Berlin lay well inside the Soviet zone of occupation and was a source of tension throughout the Cold War. This had first become apparent in 1948 with the crisis over the Berlin blockade. On the 13th of August 1961, the Soviet authorities in East Germany sealed off East Berlin by constructing a huge barbed wire barrier. This was soon replaced by a concrete wall, complete with lookout towers and armed guards who had orders to shoot anyone trying to cross into the western sector. So, why was the Berlin Wall built? Firstly, the brain drain. Throughout the 1950s, thousands of East German citizens had fled through Berlin for the West, leaving behind the harsh political climate and economic misery of life under communism. Many of those who defected were educated or highly skilled workers, and the East German authorities could not afford to lose their best and brightest citizens. Secondly, the law of the West. During the 1950s, travel was relatively easy between the eastern and western sectors of Berlin. People living under communism in the eastern sectors could visit the west and see for themselves what capitalism could offer. There was decent housing, shops full of goods to buy, and relative freedom, all provided by Western allies. Many East Germans voted with their feet, and this was an embarrassment for the communist authorities. Thirdly, espionage. Berlin was a western island in a communist sea, an ideal place for American spies to gather intelligence on the Soviet military. So what was the US response to the Berlin Wall? Alarmed by the building of the wall, President Kennedy sent his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, and US General Clay to Berlin. He also dispatched the 1st Battle Group to reinforce the Allied soldiers in West Germany. Spread along nearly 100 miles of road, the US military crossed East German territory and paraded into Berlin in an obvious show of military strength. That brings us to the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. Once the wall was up, the US decided to test how far they could push the USSR. Foreigners were still allowed to cross the wall, and the US regularly sent troops and diplomats into the Soviet sector through Checkpoint Charlie, one of the guarded crossings between the East and the West. Both sides were entitled to do this under the Four Powers Agreement made after the Yalta Conference. On the 27th of October 1961, the Soviets blocked an American diplomat crossing to the east. The USA reacted and brought tanks up to Checkpoint Charlie to reaffirm their right to cross. The Soviets responded by bringing up their own tanks to the border. All day long, the two sides, with tanks and soldiers at the ready, faced each other in a tense standoff. The nail-biting crisis lasted for 18 hours until diplomatic negotiations meant that both sides began to slowly withdraw. Next, President Kennedy visits Berlin. On the 26th of June 1963, US President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin and made a famous speech in which he claimed that Berlin was a symbol of freedom in the struggle against communism. It was a strong, defiant message and put an end to Soviet hopes of driving the Allies out of Berlin. During his famous speech, Kennedy declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," a phrase intended to mean, "I am a citizen of Berlin." His intention was to show that he was standing alongside the people of Berlin in their struggle against communism. Unfortunately, a Berliner is also a type of German jam donut, and so many misinterpreted the statement and claimed that Kennedy said, "I am a jam donut." The Berlin Wall remained a symbol of Cold War tension until it was torn down in November 1989. That brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was probably the hot spot in the Cold War. For 13 days in October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. So what was some of the background? Until 1959, it was closely allied to the United States under the leadership of right-wing dictator General Batista. There was considerable American investment in Cuba, and the US was the chief consumer of Cubans' sugar and tobacco. In 1959, Batista was overthrown in a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. Castro nationalized all American-owned companies in Cuba and refused to pay compensation. The USA now had a communist state in its own backyard. So what was the US response to the Cuban Revolution? Firstly, a trade embargo. The US imposed a trade embargo on Cuban goods, depriving Cubans of a market for their sugar and tobacco and the income to import oil and other essential goods. It's important to note that this backfired badly on the Americans, as it meant that the Cubans then looked to the USSR for a market for their sugar. The Soviets were only too happy to oblige and were soon supplying Cuba with oil and weapons. Next, the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, just after he was installed as President of the USA, John F. Kennedy approved a plan to invade Cuba and overthrow communism. The CIA landed 1,400 Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba with the aim of provoking an anti-communist uprising. They were met by 20,000 heavily armed Cuban troops and all were captured or killed. Again, it's important to note, Kennedy now looked weak and aggressive at the same time. Keep this in mind when thinking about the missile crisis. It makes him much less likely to back down in the future. And then came the discovery of the missiles. On the 14th of October 1962, a US spy plane flying over Cuba took pictures that showed the construction of Soviet missile launch sites. Experts estimated that they would be ready to fire in 7 days. Meanwhile, another American spy plane discovered 20 Soviet ships carrying nuclear missiles in the Atlantic Ocean heading for Cuba. This was a threat to the USA. Cuba was only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, meaning that the US, including many of its biggest cities like Washington DC and New York, would be well within range of these missiles. The lives of 80 million Americans were at stake. So, why did the Soviets want to put nuclear missiles on Cuba? The Soviet leader, Khrushchev, knew the US had medium and long-range nuclear missiles aimed at the USSR based in West Europe and Turkey. Secondly, domestic politics. Khrushchev wanted to strengthen his political position in the USSR and show his government that he wasn't soft on America. Thirdly, to protect Cuba. Khrushchev wanted to support the new communist country in Uncle Sam's backyard. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 helped to justify the argument that Cuba needed protection. That brings us to President Kennedy's dilemma. After talking with ExComm, his team of advisors, the US President Kennedy was faced with the following options. Firstly, to do nothing. The pros for this is war is avoided. The US still looks stronger than the USSR and Kennedy looks peaceful. The cons are the Soviets deploy nuclear missiles in America's backyard. This would also be politically difficult, as Kennedy had promised he would be tough on communism. Allowing missiles in Cuba was therefore not an option. Secondly, appeal to the United Nations. The pros are war is avoided, the US looks peaceful. The cons are the US looks weak. Missiles might still be delivered. Thirdly, blockade the island with US Navy vessels. The pros are the delivery of missiles is halted. The cons are it risks a naval battle that could escalate into war. The US didn't know there was already launch sites or missiles on Cuba. Fourthly, invade Cuba. The pros are the US could destroy the launch sites and overthrow communism. The Soviets could seize Berlin in retaliation and the situation could easily escalate. Fifthly, surgical airstrikes. The pros are airstrikes by the US Air Force could destroy the missile launch sites. The cons are there was no guarantee of destroying all the launch sites and the risk of escalation to nuclear war. So Kennedy's response? The naval blockade of Cuba. Kennedy's final decision was a US blockade of Cuba, which Kennedy called a quarantine zone, and which could stop further Soviet missiles coming to Cuba, buying him time to negotiate with the Soviets. So here's a brief rundown of the naval blockade timeline. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy imposes a naval blockade around Cuba to stop the Soviet ships suspected of carrying nuclear missiles from reaching Cuba. On the 23rd of October, Kennedy receives a letter from Khrushchev saying that the Soviet ships will not stop at the blockade but will force their way through. On the 24th of October, despite Khrushchev's tough talk, the 20 ships approaching the blockade turn back, presumably to avoid direct confrontation with the US Navy. On the 25th of October, US spy planes report increased building work at the missile launch sites on Cuba. On the 26th of October, Kennedy receives a letter from Khrushchev promising to remove the launch sites if the US agree to lift the blockade and promises not to invade Cuba. On the 27th of October, a second letter from Khrushchev says that the launch sites will only be removed if the US removes its missiles in Turkey. Kennedy opts to answer only the first fax while privately offering to consider the removal of missiles from Turkey. On the 28th of October, in a public message to President Kennedy broadcast on Moscow radio, Khrushchev agrees to the removal of all missiles on Cuba and their return to the Soviet Union. So what were the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, both sides claimed victory. Khrushchev claimed he had saved Cuba, which remains communist and heavily armed, from invasion by the USA, and has negotiated a deal with the US on their missiles in Turkey. Kennedy claims that he has kept his election promise and stood up to the USSR and kept nuclear missiles out of Cuba. The perception was that America had won, as Russia visibly removed their missiles from Cuba, creating the impression that they had backed down first. In order to ensure easier communication between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, in the event of future conflict, a hotline is installed giving a direct phone link between the White House and the Kremlin. Both the USA and the USSR realized they had been on the brink of a highly destructive nuclear war and entered into talks. These talks eventually led to the 1963 Test Ban Treaty, and it began the ending of nuclear weapons testing. In the long term, the crisis may have created a willingness on both sides to enter into the Strategic Arm Limitation Talks, or SALT, later in the 1960s. At SALT I, an agreement was reached not to build any more intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Our last topic for today is the Prague Spring. So let's again start off with some background. Czechoslovakia had been a communist country controlled by Moscow since the end of World War II. In 1968, the Czech people attempted to exert some control over their lives and reform the communist system to create socialism with a human face. That is, to keep the socialist model of government, but to guarantee a better delivery of goods, services and freedoms to the Czech people. This attempt, known as the Prague Spring, lasted for 4 months until it was crushed by the Soviet Red Army. So, what caused the Prague Spring? Firstly, the hardline communist leader Antonin Novotny was unpopular. His rule was characterized by censorship of the press and lack of personal freedom for ordinary citizens. Secondly, the Czech economy was weak, and many Czechs were bitter that the USSR controlled their economy for its own benefit. Czech farmers had to follow Communist Party guidelines on what to produce, and efforts to modernize farming were discouraged. Thirdly, some Czechs thought the USA would come to their assistance if they stood up to Moscow. So what were the events of the Prague Spring? In 1967, Czech students began peacefully demonstrating against Novotny's rule. Novotny asked the Soviet leader, Brezhnev, for help to crack down on the protests, but Brezhnev refused, and in early 1968, Novotny was replaced as Communist Party secretary by Alexander Dubček. In April 1968, Dubček announced an action plan to deliver socialism with a human face, which, in a nutshell, meant removing state control of the economy and allowed freedom of speech. Dubček's reforms began to worry the Soviets because, although he claimed to be a committed communist, Dubček proposed allowing non-communist political parties to be set up and to put up candidates for election. Dubček said that Czechoslovakia would remain in the Warsaw Pact, but welcomed Marshal Tito, president of Yugoslavia, to Prague. Yugoslavia had been communist since World War II, but was not a member of the Warsaw Pact. Moscow was wary of Tito. Then came the Soviet crackdown. To prove he meant business, on the 20th of August 1968, Brezhnev sent an invasion force of 500,000 troops from Warsaw Pact countries into Czechoslovakia. He could justify this as a group of hardline communists in Czechoslovakia wrote to the Soviets asking for help to restore order. True to the hippie ideals of the 1960s, and possibly terrified at the prospect of facing 500,000 soldiers, the Czechs did not fight back. Instead, they employed peaceful protest tactics, standing in front of tanks and offering flowers to soldiers. The student activist Jan Polak burnt himself to death in Prague's Wenceslas Square. Dubček was arrested and taken to Moscow. The pro-Soviet Gustav Husak was installed as the Czech leader to be Brezhnev's lapdog. Husak reversed Dubček's reforms, and Czechoslovakia remained a communist country inside the Warsaw Pact. Worried that Czechoslovakia was slipping from his grasp, the Soviet leader Brezhnev declared that the USSR would not allow the countries of Eastern Europe to reject communism or leave the Warsaw Pact, even if it meant a Third World War. This is known as the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like, subscribe and share. And comment below so we can clarify things for you.